Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 158 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Gavin. That is Fia. Mike is off this week. We had to do a little shenanigans, a little moving some times around this week because I wanted to make sure I could do. I basically only had one night free. Normally, we record one night and then I edit a different night. But as you might have heard, depending on what they're doing outside my office space here, my father-in-law is visiting and helping us do some projects around the house. So because he's here, I wanted to try to condense everything on one night, and so Mike had already made plans for tonight. So it's just Fia and I today. And if you hear some hammering or some stuff in the background, sorry. That's just not something I can avoid today. So if that's something that super bothers you, we'll see you next episode. If not, this is a cool episode. I like these cool little guys, as we'll talk about. As you might have seen from the title, we're talking about isopods today. Isopods are a fun little group of little critters.
They're the cutest, in my opinion.
Yes, they can be very cute. They can also be very freaky.
Yeah.
As we'll talk about. But yeah, so we don't really have too much to get into before the episode here. Do you have a seagrass corner? Fia's also coming off hot on some field work. So
yeah, I do. Perfect. I just don't have it in the notes. But before I do that, I'm just going to do some housekeeping, as
Absolutely.
we do. Don't forget to rate the show on whatever platform you listen to us on, and to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, to give us feedback about the show and any future topics you would like to hear on the pod. If you'd like to be a guest on the pod, which we would love anybody to come on, and all that stuff can be found in the show notes.
Yeah.
So, Gavin, what is next episode topic?
Next episode is going to be a little bit of a weird one. So we're going to be talking about taphonomy.
What does that mean?
You might have heard us talk on the show a lot, probably almost every episode, about taxonomy. Taphonomy is different, even though they sound very similar. Taxonomy is how different animals are related, or different groups of life are related, and how we give them names. Taphonomy is basically the study of everything that happens to an organism between the time when it dies and when scientists find it as a fossil.
Whoa.
All the stuff that happens in between.
Cool.
Yeah, so it's going to be a weird one. This is very much more of a concept episode. And if I'm being a little honest with you, dear listeners, after 158 episodes, the concept ones are a little harder to come across.
Right.
Things that we haven't talked about already. Because I also don't want every single episode to be about a group of life. That just gets a little repetitive.
Yeah.
We could do that. We'd never run out of stuff to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
But I like these kind of concept ones. So, that's what we're going to be talking about next time. A lot of dead stuff.
Cool. Well, thanks for that, Gavin. I'm going to take over here with Seagrass Corner.
Absolutely.
This idea was brought to me by one of my lab mates, Bella. So if you're listening, Bella, hi and thank you. I wanted to talk about the Caribbean monk seal, which I didn't really know about, but it's also known as the West Indian seal or the sea wolf, and it is an extinct species of seal native to the Caribbean. They're similar to the Hawaiian island, the Hawaiian monk seals, which are very endangered right now, and the Mediterranean monk seal. And so, these were big seals in the Caribbean, and their predators were sharks, like great whites and tiger sharks, and potentially some orcas too. But the most distinct predator was humans, and was most likely the reason why they died, because they were overhunted for oil and meat, and then their natural prey were overfished as well. And so that leads us to their extinction. Their last confirmed sighting in the Caribbean was 1952. in the
Okay.
west waters of Jamaica. And then in 2008, the species was officially declared extinct by the United States after a 5-year search.
Yeah. I think that's kind of the standard is like I'm sure it varies a little bit, but
Right.
yeah, 5 years, especially for something that's like a fairly large animal.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, they're probably gone. Uh,
Right. So,
but
yeah, let's talk about some bugs.
yeah, I mean, well, sort of,
Yeah, sort of.
as we'll talk about. So, isopods. These little critters have a lot of different names depending on where you live, um, but they also do a lot of really important things in their ecosystems. And so,
Oh,
a
yeah.
little bit later, I'll have a little bit of a slight content warning if you're like kind of squeamish. There's going to be some talk of parasitism and parasites and things. I know that can sometimes make people a little squeamish.
I'm so excited.
So
I already know.
yeah, yeah. So just know ahead of time that will come up. But I'll say it again. We won't just dive straight in. But yeah, so that will come up. Anywho, isopods. Isopods are a group of crustaceans. So they are related to things like crabs and lobsters and shrimp and barnacles and krill. Um, Crustaceans make up a lot of different things. Everyone thinks of like crabs, lobsters, and shrimp, I think are probably the first ones that come to mind for most people,
Yeah.
mostly because those are the ones we eat.
Yeah.
Um, but crustaceans are extremely diverse. For example, I mentioned barnacles there. They are so stinking weird compared
Yep.
to something like a crab. Um,
I almost associate them more like as bivalves, even though they aren't
yeah,
bivalves.
yeah, because they just like stick to stuff,
Yeah.
whether it's other animals like whales or boats or docks and things like that. Um, and they cement to stuff just like oysters do.
Right.
And then there's stuff like krill that are just like these teeny tiny little guys floating around in the water. That's what a lot of big baleen whales eat. Isopods are kind of this other thing. So most of the ones you are thinking of, well, we'll talk about this a little bit, are in a group called decapods, meaning they have 10 legs.
Yep.
So that's all your crabs, lobsters, shrimp, um, all the various things that are like very crabby um, or lobstery. Um, Isopods are kind of like their cousin a little bit, but we'll talk about that in just a sec. But they are crustaceans.
Awesome.
And so overall, they're pretty diverse. In the terms of invertebrates, not the largest group out there. There's about 10,000 species. For context, that is about the same number of bird species that we have.
It's kind of a lot, actually.
Right, but it's like my first frame of reference for it isn't a good one for invertebrates, which is insects, and
Yeah,
it's like
true.
you know some subgroups of insects potentially have a million species, like ants or beetles. Um,
Right.
so 10,000 is a lot for sure, but I think that there are more decapods. I don't know that for sure though. They range in size, isopods do, from like incredibly teeny tiny, as small as 0.3 millimeters,
Mm-hmm.
or for us here in the US, 1/100th of an inch as an adult, up to about 50 centimeters or about 20 inches. So the
Wild.
big range in size.
Mm-hmm.
And so really quick, what is a crustacean? And
Um,
how are they different from other invertebrates? Because most people are like passingly familiar enough with like insects because they live where we live. Crustaceans, by and large, don't. So, what makes crustaceans different than things like insects? So first, crustaceans are arthropods, meaning that they're invertebrates with jointed legs. That's sort of their main thing. That's what arthropod means. They also have segmented bodies and exoskeletons. So, like, a good example of one that people would probably be familiar with is a lobster.
Mm-hmm.
They have legs that, can bend in different places. They have segmented bodies. You think of like a lobster's tail, how it has the different sort of almost like layers that overlap each other. And they have that hard shell. So arthropods, all of them, include things like insects, spiders, scorpions and horseshoe crabs, shrimp, crabs and lobsters, centipedes, and millipedes. That's generally the groups of arthropods. So they sort of come in like three large groups, mostly based on like what their mouth looks like, weirdly. So first, there's the chelicerates. Those are your spiders, scorpions, horseshoe crabs, sea spiders, and mites, as well as like ticks as well. They have a set of appendages sort of at the front of the mouth called chelicerae that they use to manipulate food. In spiders, for example, that's their fangs. But for the most part, they just kind of look like a tiny little pair of like scorpion pincers on either side of the mouth. For example, although in scorpions, it's not like they turned the little ones into the big ones. Those big ones are just modified legs. They have like a very teeny tiny pair, like right next to their actual mouth.
Okay.
Next, we have the myriapods. Those are your centipedes and millipedes. They have like almost like plates around their mouth that they move to cut up food with, as well as inside the mouth they have a pair of mandibles that they can like extend out of the mouth to grab food.
Ew.
Yeah. And then centipedes also, this isn't part of like their mouth technically. They have modified their first pair of legs into fangs, basically, so they quote-unquote bite. It's not really biting because it's just legs. But that's how they inject their venom and stuff. If you've ever seen like the giant centipedes like quote-unquote bite somebody, that's basically just pointing or punching them with like really pointy front legs.
I never knew.
Yeah. And then lastly, we have the crustaceans, which is basically all the rest. Crabs, lobsters, shrimp, isopods, but also insects, like flies, beetles, butterflies, bees, etc. Based on our current understanding of their evolution and relatedness, insects technically are a group of crustaceans.
Okay.
This isn't an insects episode, though, so this is one of the last times we're talking about insects. This group is like incredibly variable with their mouths. Obviously, like I said, there are multiple groups of insects that potentially have 1 million species in them. So they do very wildly different things with their mouths. So it's there is like a formal definition, but that's not particularly useful because many of them have since evolved on that and changed that.
Yeah.
So it's basically chelicerates, myriapods, and then all the rest.
And so
isopods.
Okay, yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say isopods are crustaceans.
Yes.
Cool.
Isopods are in sort of what most people would kind of think of the main group of crustaceans. So it's like if you are capable of picturing a crustacean in your mind, it's almost certainly in this sort of subgroup called Malacostraca. Basically, well, first of all, if you're thinking of a crustacean, it's almost certainly a decapod.
Yeah.
So that's decapods, like I said, crabs, lobsters, shrimp, crayfish, or crawdads, depending on where you live. Those are the only ones most people would think of, right? Also, like I said, krill. Krill aren't quite decapods. They're sort of like really closely related, but not quite. And so decapods and krill are in that group, the Malacostraca. Their next closest cousin in there are isopods and their relatives.
Okay.
So Isopods and their relatives, sort of their little branch within Malacostraca, are weird among crustaceans in that most of them have, you might know this as someone who, like, lives in the world. Isopods are very commonly found on land.
Yep. Roly
And while
Polies.
there are some, fairly well adapted, mostly crabs, to living on land, they don't live that far from water. Almost never live very far from water. And even the ones that do have to make, like, migrations back to the sea to lay eggs.
Oh,
Think of it sort of like a reverse sea turtle.
cool.
They live on land basically all their lives, but when it's time for them to breed, they have to go back in, like, these big migrations to the ocean.
Cool.
Isopods and their relatives are special, though, in that they have sort of a pouch, like a kangaroo. It's called a marsupium. And they keep their eggs in that pouch until they hatch. And then even for a couple of molts, like sheds, after that.
Wow, I didn't know
And
that.
so, by the time that they are sort of born and released from the pouch, they more or less look like small adults. And that's really strange.
Yeah.
No other crustaceans really do that.
Yeah.
And so not only do they just, like, carry them around, they also, like, put nutrients in there and stuff. So they really, like, take really good care of their eggs and their, like, fairly, freshly born babies.
Can you, like, tell if isopods are pregnant? I feel like, like with shrimp, like they carry the eggs like kind of on the outside. I don't know if
Right.
I've ever seen an isopod look like it had eggs.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
So, I mean, picture in your mind, again, a lobster, right? So they have their big claws up front. They have their, like, bigger legs sort of just behind that. And then under their tail, they have all these little things that look like little legs.
Yeah.
In a lot of different decapod species, that's kind of how they swim.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think all of those are sort of modified into what forms the pouch.
Okay.
So I
Yeah.
think more or less they just look like they don't have those, or they are just using those to hold something underneath. But it makes, like, a watertight seal.
Cool.
Yeah. And so this isn't just isopods, it's also some of, like, their close relatives. But that's sort of what makes their group unique, is that they have this pouch. Which even the marine ones and the ones that live fully in water have.
Cool.
So, of all of those crustaceans that have this pouch, only isopods have really made strong adaptations for life on land. Because, they no longer need to go where the water is to lay their eggs anymore. They bring the water with them in their pouch. And so, think of it kind of like the difference between, like, toads and lizards. Toads are very well adapted to living on land. They don't need to be wet constantly like frogs do. And they can go a really long time without water, but at the end of the day, to reproduce, they need water. Lizards, on the other hand, lay eggs that are sealed with the water inside.
Yeah.
And because of that, they can live a lot further away from reliable sources of water. So crabs are like the toads. Isopods are like the lizards.
Cool. Makes sense.
And so, with that, other than the pouch, how exactly are isopods different from other crustaceans like crabs, lobsters, etc.? First, number of legs. Decapods, as you might assume by the name, have 10 legs, including the front pair, which many have turned into claws. Isopods only have 7 pairs, Or so I guess they have more. They have 7 pairs instead of 5, so they have 14 legs total. And they don't turn any into claws, really. Some of them, depending on how well they're able to swim, might have turned a couple of them a little more paddle-shaped. In general, though, isopods aren't very good swimmers. Many crustaceans, like I mentioned a little bit ago, have those little tiny appendages toward the back of their body that are used for various things like breathing in a lot or holding eggs. Isopods have those, but like I said, they're kind of different. They're also technically not considered legs in any of them because they're not like jointed in the same way as the front legs are. And also all of their, in isopods, all of their actual legs are basically always the same shape and size as each other. Unlike decapods where it can vary quite a lot. Like obviously they turned the front pair, a lot of them, into claws.
Yeah.
And if you just look at a lobster's legs, the other, sort of front ones tend to be a little bit bigger and they get a little smaller toward the back. In isopods, they're pretty much the same front to back. Isopods are also a lot more conserved in their shape than decapods are, meaning that, for the most part, there are exceptions, they all look roughly like Roly Polies. Some are a bit flatter, some that live on land. For example, some of them that live on land but like underground are kind of like really long and skinny and don't at all look like a roly poly.
Yeah. There's some in my seagrasses that are like that too.
Yeah. But for the most part, they all have a pretty oblong body made up of a series of like articulating plates that allow some of them to be able to curl up into a ball for protection. Hence the name roly poly. And so, what do isopods do? What's their deal? For the most part, whether they are marine or terrestrial, isopods generally are really good scavengers and decomposers. They sort of scuttle around the floor of forests or the ocean and eat detritus. That is all of the bits of dead stuff and also poop, and other organic matter that hasn't already been broken down yet. That is sort of like their claim to fame in a lot of ways. And because of this, they're obviously very important to their ecosystems because otherwise there's just not a lot else. Like there are other things, especially in marine ecosystems. There's always worms and stuff digging through the sediment, eating these little organic particles. But on land, there's less of those things, but also they're just one of the best at doing it. They have a really interesting relationship with, symbiotic relationship with gut bacteria in a lot of their environments that let them break down stuff that other organisms just can't.
That's cool.
Yeah. And so because of decomposers like isopods, nutrients basically that would otherwise get buried and, taken out of like being bioavailable, or stuff that would just sit there and be broken down a lot more slowly by bacteria and fungi, they basically keep the nutrients flowing in the ecosystem because they eat this stuff that no one else can, and then they obviously in turn get eaten by various things and keep those nutrients from falling out of the ecosystem, basically.
We love detritivores.
Absolutely. And this is true of basically all of the terrestrial isopods. Pretty much all of them are exclusively this. Some of them do eat like living plants, but there's no predatory ones. I don't think there are any parasitic terrestrial ones. But yeah, the ones all on land, it's a single group of them. They're collectively called wood lice. No relation to things like head lice, though, because those are insects. Woodlice are called that because they're very good at breaking down the lignin and cellulose that makes wood so hard and is really difficult for other things to break down. For example, there's, I think, maybe a handful of species of vertebrates total that can kind of break down wood.
Right.
So especially these days, a lot of vertebrate-dominated ecosystems, when a tree dies, isopods are some of the first things to really get in there and, again, keep those nutrients from that tree from just getting buried and taken out of circulation. Otherwise, it would take things like bacteria and fungi, so much longer to break down like a full tree than it would for isopods to do it.
Cool.
And in fact, these guys are like so important to, especially like temperate forest and a lot of like rainforest and tropical forest ecosystems. So this is like the main thing they're studied for, is their ability to nutrient cycle in forests. That said, they don't only live in forests. They don't quite have, despite being pretty well adapted to land, they're not as well adapted as most of the other arthropod groups that live on land. Mostly in that their cuticle, so like their exoskeleton, is not as like watertight, basically. So they dry out a lot faster than a spider or an insect. But there is one species that lives basically all across North Africa and into the Middle East. It's called Hemilepistis raumori, I think. But yeah, lives in North Africa and the Middle East, and it seems to be the main food source for basically other invertebrate in that environment. For example, in places where it and a particular species of scorpion overlap, this single species makes up 70% of that scorpion's diet. So there's a very important prey species. And this one species, so think about it, just one species of little tiny isopod makes up about half the biomass relative to mammals in those areas that it lives. Like all mammals together. And this is an area that has camels and, depending on, kind of narrowly around the Nile River, but also like hippos. So they can have up to 200,000 of them in an acre of land in these areas. And while, yeah, it's a desert, there's not a lot of plants there, they're kind of the only animal, I guess, really doing a lot of the nutrient cycling of dead plant material. And so they basically they also live in like little family groups. So they don't just, we mammals tend to think that we are the only ones who take care of our children. But a lot of invertebrates do it. More than you would think, anyway. And these guys live in like little family groups. They have just like a single like vertical burrow that goes like 2 feet down into the soil. And when it's really hot, they go all the way to the bottom of it. And then they come out at night to eat the dead leaves and stuff. And they are extremely successful in these areas.
Cool.
And then lastly, for woodlice, they're often bought and sold in the pet trade. And,
oh, man.
Also, less often, but also in the garden trade.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, many people who keep reptiles as pets will buy some isopods to put in their enclosure.
I thought people were just buying isopods as pets.
Well, a little bit. But yeah, people will not just get them for that, but people do selectively breed them. And they have found, certain morphs, just like, how ball pythons come in a ton of different varieties of like scale patterns and colors and stuff. There
Yeah.
are some that have like really bright pinks and bright oranges that you can buy. So
Wow.
not only are they helping your reptile's tank be more, basically they'll eat your, lizard or snake's poop for you, and enrich the soil and help if you have live plants in their enclosure. It'll help them grow better. It also just like they eat a lot of fungus. So especially if you have like a tropical reptile or something, they'll keep the tank from getting like super like mold infested.
Hmm.
So people put them in there to basically help keep it natural and healthy. But also people, because they're like, well, they're doing a job, but they're also ornamental.
Yeah.
People have selectively bred these really beautiful colors in them. And some people do also like just kind of buy them as pets occasionally too. Like some people,
That's so
I've
cool.
never really been interested, but I know like some people really like, was it like the giant hissing cockroaches?
Oh no.
Similar kind of deal. Obviously, these are a lot smaller.
But different.
Yes. And then some people also buy them to put in their garden to help the soil. I do not advise that. I guess you could look up to see if they're native to your area and then do it. I guess, but
Oh
yeah,
yeah.
don't just buy isopods to stick in your outdoor garden if they're not native. The native ones will probably find it. But I
Yeah.
know some people do that with like earthworms, for example.
Yo,
So similar deal.
I encourage the listeners to look up the colorful isopods because they're way more intricate than I think we're giving them
They're
credit here
so
for.
pretty.
There's multiple like tones and patterns
Mm-hmm.
on them. Like this is really cool.
Yeah. So, like I said, not only do they, help you take better care of your animals, if that's something your animal needs, but also it also adds to the color and depending on what kind of reptile you have, potentially even food for your reptile.
Yeah.
So yeah, they do a lot of cool stuff. And lastly, sort of before we move on to the rest of isopods, because this is about half of them.
Oh god.
Yeah, so there's this is about half of all isopods are in this one group of woodlice. And so, although you might think of them with like rotting wood, rotting trees, and decay and stuff, they're generally not pests. Unlike termites, which will eat wood regardless of its condition, isopods don't eat non-rotting wood. So basically, if you see them like in and around your house, that's often a sign that there's like a deeper problem. Because the isopods wouldn't be there if the wood wasn't already rotting. So it can be a sign that there's like a long-term leak somewhere in your house. So if you see them around, follow them. Check out where they are going.
Yeah.
And so they're just helpful little guys who they don't bite. They aren't really pests and are often very helpful to people. And also, I just thought this was quite funny. There are so many different common names for these guys all around the world.
How many?
So many. I grew up calling them roly polies or pill bugs. But I'd also heard people call them potato bugs.
Oh
And stuff like that. But as I was just going through, this was from the Wikipedia page, so grain of salt. People in various places around the world call them, among other things, armadillo bugs,
yeah. Oh.
boat builders, butcher boys, butchie boys, carpenters, calfners, cheese logs, cheesy bobs, cheesy bugs, chiggy pigs, chisel pigs, chucky pigs, fat pigs, doodle bugs, grammar sows, hog louse, quaw quaw. I don't know what that one's from. Sow bugs, slaters, wood bunters, wood bugs, or wood pigs.
They're really getting
depending on where you
compared
live.
to a lot of farm animals.
Yeah, and so the comparison to pigs honestly isn't a terrible one.
Yeah.
Pigs also are generalists who will eat most things.
Right.
But
It's like
isopods just kind of do it on a much smaller scale than
right.
pigs do, obviously. Oh yeah. Sorry for some background noise, listeners. This time it's not my father-in-law or my wife. It just started raining out of nowhere. Anywho, yeah. So that is about half of isopod diversity is the woodlice living up on land. Yeah. There might be some weird editing in this episode, listeners. My power just went out while we were recording. Thankfully, Audacity is a very good program, and was able to insta-save what I did this entire past recording. So thank you, Audacity, for being a good open source program.
Cheers to technology.
Yes. And so, yeah, so while I said that's half of isopods, and while all the terrestrial ones are detritivores across the board, some, actual herbivory in there a bit, the marine ones do just about everything.
Okay, I was totally thinking this earlier, and when you said that they were mostly detritivore, or they were just detritivores, I was Googling it, and I was like, is this true? I feel like I've seen isopods in my samples that are filter feeders, and now I'm confused.
Yes. Yep. Well, with the ones on land, it's being a terrestrial filter feeder just kind of doesn't work.
Oh yeah, no, that would be impossible.
Yeah. But yeah, so that's just the terrestrial ones. The marine ones do basically anything you can think of. Many still are detritivores or scavengers, scuttling across the seafloor to eat dead animals. They're very common at whale falls, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Others just sort of skim the surface of the sediment for poop or single-celled, organisms that sink and fall to the bottom when they die. Still very important nutrient cyclers in their environments there too. Also, sort of like I mentioned, isopods generally are not very good swimmers. So they don't really hang out in the water column much, at least as adults.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the very teeny tiny little ones do, just because by nature they're teeny tiny. But that's more drifting than swimming. Some are predatory, truly predatory. Not many of them though. They basically just use that front pair of legs to grab prey, kind of just anything smaller than them. Some, like I said, are filter feeders. They eat, all the different stuff that's typically not dead yet. That's in the water. A lot of isopods, I didn't see it expanded on much further than this, but I kept seeing, this isopod has an interesting relationship with sponges. Where it seems like a lot of different isopods kind of just hang out inside sponges.
Yep.
Yeah, so I again didn't see much else about it, but there's apparently a number of isopods that just like sponges. Like many groups of invertebrates, though, many are parasitic. And so here is your content warning if you are kind of squeamish. You may want to skip ahead several minutes, because I'm going to talk about it at a little bit of length here.
I'm so excited.
So parasitism is very common in invertebrates in general, across the board. We had a whole episode about parasitism, episode 141. For example, just think of all of the different species of parasites humans have. Just to name a few, we have head lice, body lice, which are different. Those are two different lice. Bot flies, the Demodex mites that live in our hair follicles, like your eyelashes, tapeworms, mosquitoes, bed bugs, guinea worm, pinworm, hookworm, ticks, and the list goes on. Many of them are opportunistic and can parasitize a wide range of hosts like ticks. Ticks will, whether it's deer ticks, mouse ticks, spotted ticks, a variety. They'll feed on basically anything. Some are a bit more choosy, but still have a handful of potential hosts. For example, like many species of mosquitoes, specifically the genus Anopheles. That's one of the main genera of mosquitoes, but there are some species that prefer humans, but technically can feed on other mammals, and some can feed on birds too, but they prefer humans. But many parasites are specific to their host. For example, in human head lice and body lice cannot survive on cats and dogs. They just can't. They don't have the right claws and hooks to climb around in their fur. They don't have the right mouth parts to eat their dead skin and get into bite them and get to their blood. Their blood chemistry isn't quite right for them. So human lice are extremely human specific.
Yeah. Is this similar to marine isopods or different?
Depends.
Okay.
And just another quick example, because parasites are cool and weird. For example, some tapeworms, some species can live just fine in the intestines of cows or pigs, but they can only reproduce in the intestines of humans. Parasites are weird.
Yeah.
And so that's only a handful of the parasites that are animals. And that's completely leaving out all of the protozoan parasites that humans have, like the ones that cause malaria or giardia or babesiosis. Parasites are crazy. So with that, I say all that just to sort of point out that being parasitic is a good way to become very diverse very quickly. Parasites, especially ones that aren't very mobile, have a really high selection pressure to become very host-specific, because it's relatively uncommon for animals in the wild to spend a lot of time with individuals of other species. So if you can get really good at infecting your specific host, you're generally kind of set. Isopods make for very good parasites. They, across the board, parasitize basically anything in the ocean. Name it, it's probably got an isopod parasite.
Yeah.
But they especially like fish and other crustaceans. Mm-hmm. Mostly because they can get all up in their gills.
Yep. It's nasty.
Yeah. And gills are a great place for parasites because it's just an easy target. There's a lot of blood flow there, and it's not really once you're in there, it's not really heavily protected or anything. And so all you basically need to do is have a flat enough body to squeeze in between. It's called the operculum, the sort of gill covering of fish, and in things like sharks, they don't even have that. And so if you parasitize a shark, you don't even need a flat body. You just need to get on the shark. But in other crustaceans, depending on what part of the crustacean the isopod is kind of getting at, their gills are especially in things like lobsters or shrimp, their gills are extremely readily available.
Yeah.
They're just right out there.
Yep. Super easy.
Crabs, it's a little harder since they sort of keep them folded up a little bit more. But they also can sort of just wiggle in between the sort of plates of the exoskeleton of shrimp or lobsters. And so many species of shrimp and lobsters, less so crabs, but there are still some, have isopod parasites. And they are, as far as parasites go, isopod parasites don't tend to be extremely host specific. It seems to be this parasitic isopod species can parasitize a family of shrimp.
Yeah.
That's generally the pattern.
Yeah.
And some of them, like I said, they get all up in the gills and stuff. Some, especially that parasitized fish, take a less covert approach and just bite the skin through the scales, basically just like ticks, more or less. Some can also bore holes into the shells of crabs, and they basically just like live on the inside of the crab, but they can come and go as they want because they have an escape hole. Yeah, parasites are just so freaky. Go listen to episode 141. It was one of my favorite ones that we've done in a long time.
Yeah.
But there's one particularly famous example.
Are you going to talk about the tongue?
I sure am.
Oh, this is the best.
So this is a species called Cymathoa exigua, I think, that parasitizes a handful of species of fish. I think, depending on how you count them, about 7 species. As juveniles, the isopods live in the gills of the fish, but once a female gets old enough, she climbs up into the mouth of the fish, severs the blood vessels that feed the tongue, and eats from those. Eventually, the tongue just doesn't get any blood anymore, and it withers and falls out, and it dies. The isopod then replaces the tongue and effectively becomes the fish's tongue.
Yep.
This is the only known example. There are other species in this genus that do something similar, but for this genus is the only example of a parasite replacing a body part in their host.
Yeah. There was
literally
one crawling on my wetsuit last week.
Ew.
Yeah. But like it was really
Which,
cute.
to be fair, they can't do that to humans.
Right. Yeah. No.
At worst, they might bite you.
Right. I've never been bitten by an isopod.
They technically can, but like.
Well, I'm just saying it's never happened.
Yeah.
Or I didn't feel it.
Right. And what's also interesting is that so many species of isopod, or honestly many species of invertebrates in general, can spontaneously change their sex under certain conditions. And so when there is no female present in the fish's gills, so for example, when they're all juveniles, if it all is just men, one of the males will just grow larger and become the female, and then that is the one that goes and replaces the tongue. So it's only the females that end up replacing the tongue.
Whoa.
They need all that extra blood flow to be pumping out babies.
Well, where do the males go?
Oh, they just stay in the gills.
Oh.
Yep.
Cool.
Yeah. So this is, and if you go to like the Wikipedia page for it, it's almost comical because like it's somebody holding a fish and like sort of pushing on the side of its mouth to open it. And so there's just a guy with a fish in his hand. And then inside, you can like fully see it. Like you can see like the isopod's eyes inside the mouth of the fish.
Yeah.
And like, yes, this is still parasitism, but like fish don't do all that much with their tongue relative to like, especially humans since we use it to talk, but even like a dog. Fish can't stick their tongue out of their mouth. And it's mostly just like fully anchored to the bottom of their mouth. So like the ones in the gills, for sure, those are parasites because they're stealing its blood. But the ones in that actually take over the tongue, I don't know. That seems more like was it commensalism, where it's like one benefits and the other is like meh.
I think I disagree with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, because like you have to think about it. It's almost like a tapeworm where it's like taking away the nutrients for the fish. And so eventually it gets to a point where the fish is losing biomass and body weight.
Yeah.
Because the isopod's getting too big and growing. And I don't know if there's a point where the fish just dies because it's like starving to death, or if that's
Generally, no.
no.
No. So parasites tend to be really good at not killing their host
Okay. Yeah.
because if they kill their host, then their food supply goes away.
Right. Yeah.
But no, yeah, you're probably right. It also probably takes more blood than the tongue would have if it was still there. So
yeah,
you're right. But anyway, just such a weird, cool example of
oh, it
parasitism.
is. It really is.
So that is all. And do you have any other interesting isopods and things that you want to bring up before we move on to the fossil record, which, spoilers, is not much?
No, I don't think so. I mean, like, yeah, the tongue one is the classic one, and then like the ones that like tuck under like the side of like shrimps, like side that like I don't know. There's like a famous TikToker that like takes them off.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can find so many videos online of people. They'll just like sift in the sand on a beach, and this just goes to show like how everywhere parasites are, because basically there's lots of different crabs or other crustaceans that just live in the sand on a beach. And almost every single one will have one of these isopod parasites.
Yeah.
Like, this isn't like I mean, it's social media, so it very well could be like a planted thing, but like, it probably not, because parasites are just that common in nature. It's a miracle that we aren't constantly being parasitized all the time. And that's mostly because we live in like a developed, wealthy country.
Right.
But yeah, definitely look up those videos because they're also very satisfying.
Mm-hmm.
If you're not kind of squeamish from parasites. Anyway, welcome back to the people who don't like parasites. So yeah, so let's talk about the fossil record. That's all what they were like today.
Yeah.
What were they like in the past? As I mentioned, not a lot to work with here.
Right.
Isopods tend to live in a lot of places that do not fossilize well, like forests or the very deep sea, or the insides of other animals.
Right.
So, they also their exoskeletons aren't quite as sturdy or like heavily mineralized as like their decapod cousins, like crabs.
That's interesting.
Crabs tend to make very good fossils, provided they get buried fairly quickly. Otherwise, they just kind of fall apart. But yeah, isopods first show up in the fossil record in the late Carboniferous period, about 300 million years ago. And although that's when they first show up, that's not like we have like the first one. There are fossils from like all around the world from this time. So it's likely that they evolved before this and just kind of dodged the fossil record for a while until the Carboniferous.
Okay.
See episode 81 for more on the Carboniferous period. And back then, they kind of seemed more or less the same as isopods that we have today. They were a little bit different, seemingly a bit more sedentary, so very much the just crawling on the bottom of the ocean style. And they kind of refer to these groups that were around as short-tailed isopods. They don't really have tails in the vertebrate sense. It's basically just like the last few segments of their body sort of fused together to form what's called a telson. Not super important. I
know too much about telsons.
Yeah. Yeah, that is how to tell the difference between a lot of different species of arthropods.
Yeah.
And so around the time that Pangea broke up, about 200 million years ago or so, a new long-tailed group evolved that was more active and seemingly outcompeted those short-tailed ones. The short-tailed ones are still around today in a few isolated places, mostly sort of scattered around Oceania and South Asia, with the exception of woodlice, which are in that short-tailed group. And so because they're so small and live on land, they don't leave very good fossils. The first woodlouse fossils that we have are all from the Cretaceous period in amber. But because they live all across the world, it seems more likely that they evolved and came up onto land while Pangea was still together and got onto the different continents before Pangea broke up. But without fossils, it's really hard to know for sure. And then we have potentially one example, or with possible evidence of parasitism from the Jurassic period, about 165 million years ago. But it is extremely difficult to infer behavior from fossils, so unsure. It seems to be related to a group that is exclusively parasites, so that's pretty good evidence, but it's not like they found it, fossilized in the gill area of a fish or something. So, yeah, that is we have pretty good isopod fossils, but they seem to just kind of be there as fairly modern forms.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have a great, consistent, track record, unfortunately, but that's isopods. So with that, Fia, do you have any isopod anecdotes or other things you'd like to share about these little guys?
No, I think everything we talked about was pretty spot on.
Well, thanks.
Yeah.
So with that, I have been Gavin. That has been Fia, and this has been episode 158 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. Mike will hopefully be back with us next episode, but until then, take care, everybody. This episode of I Wish You Were Dead was written by Gavin Davidson and hosted by Gavin Davidson, Mike Bryson, and Finella Campanino. It was sound edited and edited for YouTube by Gavin Davidson. Special thanks to former guests of the pod and to listeners like you.